Well, hello and welcome back. I am Guy Stevens, and you are here at the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. Excited to have you here today. We've got another great show in store for you. I do want to tell you a little bit about who I am and what the Alliance is in case this is your first time here. And if it's not, well, I'm glad to see you back. Of course, I am the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, an organization that began about 5 years ago. And if you recently had an opportunity to catch our anniversary special. We had a 5-year anniversary special recently, talking about the Alliance and all the things that we're doing, and it was a great, fun opportunity. Actually, the host of that was not me. I was not the host. I was a guest on that one, and that was a lot of fun. Anyway, if you're not familiar with the Alliance, we are an organization that started about 5 years ago. We are focused on not just restraint and seclusion, but really looking at restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, trying to reduce and eliminate punitive approaches to discipline that often are leading to a lot of trauma, that are leading kids down the school to prison pipeline, that are leading to poor outcomes. And we're out there really advocating for positive changes that are aligned with trauma-informed approaches and neuroscience-aligned approaches, relationship-driven approaches, collaborative approaches, and of course, neurodiversity-affirming approaches. So we do a lot of work in that area and really trying to promote positive change. So I do want to tell you, we've got a special guest with us today, and Angie Zara is going to be joining us today. We're going to be talking a bit about educator well-being and how, these are tough times out there right now, and how educators have to be aware of their own stress response in education and to navigate that. So we will be talking about that in our show today. I do want to let you know that, as always, today's session is being recorded. So if you're able to watch it live, fantastic. But if you're not able to catch the whole thing live, it will be available after the fact on YouTube, LinkedIn, and on Facebook. And of course, we also make it available as an audio podcast. So if you want to go back and listen to it, if you like to or prefer to listen on the go while you're exercising or driving somewhere, you can also download it as an audio podcast. So it's great to have some options here. I do want to share with you before we get to our guest. We do have a couple of sponsors that are sponsoring our podcast here, which is really fantastic. Helps us to do the work that we're trying to do here. And our first one that I want to share with you is actually from Supportable Solutions. Supportable Solutions has been a fantastic sponsor for our podcast. And Supportable Solutions, of course, is an organization that is run by Connie Persick, who is a friend and collaborator and somebody out there doing amazing work. And let me share with you a quick spot from Supportable Solutions.
Supportable Solutions, your partner in educational excellence. We provide coaching for schools of all sizes and age groups. Let's dive into a case study. Our support led to tangible results. A middle school student's understanding of expectations soared from 34% to a whopping 70%. Through our coaching, teachers learned the power of student input. This simple strategy led to a significant increase in students' understanding and appreciation of their classroom expectations. We didn't stop there. We coached teachers on strategies to explicitly teach expectations, procedures, and routines. Empowering educators, one strategy at a time. Thrilled? That's an understatement. Discover how you can implement these change strategies today at supportablesolutions.com.
And we thank Supportable Solutions for sponsoring our podcast. You may also know they're also known for the Y Toolkit, which is a fantastic product, and you should check it out. You can get to the Y Toolkit, and Courtney has put the link there as well. I do want to mention also, I'm going to give another call out here for Blue Jack Kids, which is another sponsor that has sponsored a couple of our episodes here this year. And I'm going to play a quick spot here from Blue Jack Kids, and then we will get on with the program.
Are you looking for a trauma-informed social-emotional learning program? Look no further. Blue Jack Kids has created an amazing collection of SEL videos with ready-to-use lesson plans and activity worksheets. The Trauma-Informed Educators Network had a chance to review the content, and this is what they said. We love that Blue Jack Kids incorporates neuroscience to help students understand their brains and emotions. The videos are so well done with a clear focus on diversity, belonging, and inclusion. Video collections are appropriate for elementary ages. If you want to get started, go to bluejackkids.com and you can use the code SEL10 for a 10% discount on a year subscription. Check them out.
And we thank Blue Jack Kids and Supportable Solutions for helping sponsor our podcast that helps us to bring these shows to you every 2 weeks and sometimes even more frequently. So if you are watching live already, and I see a number of you are, if you're watching live already, If you've been here before, you know the drill. And the drill is, tell us in the chat who you are and where you're from. It's always fun to see who we have returning back. We've got a lot of loyal listeners and viewers that come back week after week when we do these and join the program. And I always love to see the familiar faces, but I'm also really excited to see people that maybe are joining us for the first time. So let us know in the chat who you are and where you're joining us from. And with that, let's move into why you're here today. I want to introduce to you our special guest today. Really excited to introduce Angie Zara to you. And Angie, I'm gonna read through Angie's bio, and then I'm going to add a little bit to it as well. But Angie was born and raised in the heart of Washington, D.C., and Angie found her passion in education in 2015, serving students and caregivers in her hometown. As an elementary school teacher in a Title I full inclusion classroom, Angie learned early on about the power of research-based trauma-informed strategies, and her philosophy was forever change. She has firsthand experience on the impact of trauma-informed education and the direct correlation to powerful relationships and increased student achievement in diverse learning communities. Through what Angie refers to as walking the walk, she pioneered the vision and creation of a brand new position of social emotional learning specialist in her elementary school, currently serving in this position with other new exciting things on the way as well. Angie has provided professional development, classroom modeling, and coaching to educators on trauma-informed practices and strategies to promote awareness and relational safety for all in the classroom and school community. After accomplishing this role in its first year, Angie is proud to say that it has been created across the entire local education agency in the middle school and high school setting. And that's a fantastic achievement. Not only did Angie create kind of her own job, it turned out that that was so successful that they began to replicate it. And this only fuels the fire that this work must be shared widely and authentically. Angie completed the Applied Educational Neuroscience Certificate from Butler University in 2021, and that's actually how we, I think, first connected, and has had the privilege to work closely with Dr. Lori Desautel. These collaborations include designing and incorporating various applications within her Applied Educational Neuroscience framework. These are focused on wellness practices as an educator, nervous system, and intentionally incorporating equity within the AEN pillars. In addition to national presentations and working full-time in her school, Angie serves as an adjunct faculty for Dr. Desautel's Applied Educational Neuroscience Certification Program, and that's a really big deal. Such an amazing program. And also consults with the Trauma Informed Educators Network under Matthew Portell. In 2023, Angie also launched her own LLC alongside of her business partner, Nicole Keller, entitled Live Well Ed. And this is an LLC that provides advocacy and education coaching to caregivers and parents of neurodiverse students to empower parents from a strength-based approach. And the most important thing that you left out of your bio is that you are my friend and colleague.
Yes.
And I'm always excited to see you, Angie. I know we get to run into each other. Ironically enough, we don't live that terribly far apart from each other,
Right.
but are probably more likely to run into each other at a conference or, in Texas or Houston or Dallas or wherever it might be. I guess next year, maybe Atlanta or, Indianapolis, who knows? But listen, I'm really excited to have you here today and excited to have a conversation with you and talk more about some things that you're really passionate about. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Guy. It is always such a pleasure to be able to sit and connect with you and talk about life and also just talk about the state of the field of education. I know you are someone whose opinion I trust so much, and you have such a wealth of knowledge in this field as well. So I'm just grateful to be here with you. And thank you for reading that very wordy bio. I think I need to work on my skill set of bringing less words, but I'm going to work on that.
There's a lot good to say. You've done some really amazing things,
you.
and I feel like I've known you through some of the journey that you've been on. Of course, you've been on the journey probably before I knew you, but just seeing the things that you've been doing and kind of taking leadership and creating a position and then creating that position, kind of creating a program and it doesn't stop. I
No, it doesn't.
know from talking to you before we went on that you've got some more exciting things coming up. I don't know if you're at liberty to talk about those, but it sounds like you've got some more exciting things coming as well. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, after 9 years in my school building, which I'm very grateful for, and creating a position which was always meant to outlive my time here, right? When we change a system,
Mhm.
we always hope that that continues aside from the individual that occupies, right, the position. But I will be moving into the DC public school setting, and I am very grateful for that. I've always told myself as a born and raised DC girly that I wanted to, find my full circle back to DCPS. I am a graduate of the great DC public school system. So I'm really excited to really immerse myself into that and get a lay of the land, and the DC landscape. So hopefully I'll be able to share some really valuable perspective, just from being able to be all over DC, coaching into different school buildings. So
Gotcha. And
I'm
what's your
really
role
excited.
going to focus on there? What kind of work will you be doing?
So my role is going to be focused on anti-racist restorative practices with
Mhm, mhm.
rooted in neuroscience. So really a lot of the same, but kind of just instead of focused on one school building with elementary school students and teachers, I'll be scaling out and focused on multiple school buildings and what are called school clusters,
Mhm.
in which I'll be assigned specific school buildings and I'll be able to coach those buildings. In best practices in relation to trauma informed practices, restorative practices, and things like that.
Now, I'm just kind of curious, and I didn't ask you this before, but is this a new position, or is it a position that was previously there and that you're moving into? Or I only
So,
ask that because you have a history of like creating new positions. So I was just kind of curious
yeah.
if this is something that
So
you're
So the
moving
great
into.
thing about DC public schools is the systems seem to have been very responsive, from the equity trauma informed lens and the lens of post pandemic education and the needs of learners in DC. So I did not create the position. It was exist in existence and it was just a perfect fit. So I kind of threw my hat in the ring and I very graciously was able to be, the person that they offered the role to. So
That's
I'll be able
fantastic.
to probably share a lot more about that once I kind of get a feel for what the day to day is like. Now I'm just, and I'm sure a lot of people know who have been leaving a job that they've been in for a long time. I'm in that in between phase where I'm trying to close things out and leave things in the best possible way for whoever takes over this role. And then also that combination of navigating totally new territory and a totally new system. I
Well,
just,
and having been in positions like that before, this is the point in my life where I'm like, am I going to be able to do what they want me to do? Do I have the right skill?
right.
I'm having all
Yeah.
those thoughts like, how am I going to do this? But knowing you, that's not a question for me. So, I'm sure you'll be
I
great, and I'm
appreciate
sure
that.
you'll put an imprint on whatever it is that you're doing there. So, congratulations on the new role. And
Thank you.
I don't know if kind of looking around the country, I'm sure that different school systems are in different places, but I'm sure you can probably come back and tell us more after you've been in this role for a while.
Yes.
One of the things we're always hoping to do is provide things that are helpful to other school systems and districts across the nation. And when we have people like you moving into roles like that, there's a real opportunity to create positive change that
Mhm.
then we need to get out there to others so that they can replicate. So I look forward to in fact, we're already booking a year out. So maybe we should go, Courtney, maybe we should go ahead and get
Yeah,
Angie on
let's
for
get
about
that
a year
scheduled.
from now so that we can talk about what you've done and here and in the role. So listen, congratulations again. And we're
Thank
going to have a
you.
conversation today. I do want to pause for a second and just tell people that if you're watching live, please, in the chat, tell us who you are and where you're from. And I see that Mel has already jumped in and said, my name is Mel. I'm a board member of Seattle Special Education PTSA and worked on Senate Bill 1479 to ban restraint and isolation, which is a bill we're going to have to come back and work on some more because we've not been able to get that one over the finish line yet. But Mel, thank you for your work on that. And others that are watching, please, in the chat, tell us who you are and where you're from. So, Angie, we're going to have a conversation today. And I think really probably what prompted this conversation, and you'll probably remember the time better than I will. Last fall, we were together at Butler University for an event, and you did a presentation where you talked a bit about kind of educator well-being, that these
Mhm.
are really difficult times right now. And, you talked about kind of the current conditions out there in education and why it's easy. It's easy for a lot of us. I think whether you're an educator or a parent, it's easy for us to be focused on students, and of course that's appropriate to focus on students. However, if we are not also very focused on educators and the educator nervous system, we're missing something really important, because at the end of the day, we need well-regulated adults who are able to help children that may need help. And if an educator is not able to attend to their own needs and their own nervous system, this can be really not only difficult, but I think can be very challenging to navigate. So anyway, let's start with a little bit of background, if you would,
Yes.
and talk to us a little bit about, before we even get into well-being, like, what's it like out there? Because I know in your role, not only working in school in DC and working now across the system there, that you also, in your role with the Trauma Informed Educators Network and with Dr. Lori Desautel's, you work with a lot of educators from around the country. Um, what are educators seeing? What are they experiencing? What are things like out there right now for our educators?
Yeah, I think something that has been very interesting for me as someone who was an educator before the pandemic, through the pandemic, and by educator, I mean teacher, classroom
Mhm,
teacher,
mhm.
before the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, and then moving into a coaching role after the pandemic, is that there seemed to be a shift. I heard a lot of conversations around changes in student behavior and how certainly there are lagging skills that we are seeing in children as an outcome of increased isolation in the pandemic, lack of social connection, and just those skills that kids get through connectedness and
Yeah,
social
and a
settings.
worldwide traumatic event, right? I mean, we had
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
So I hear a lot and heard a lot about the behavior of children. But what I started to notice, particularly in the last 2 years, which is when I moved into a coaching role, is a shift in behavior of educators. And while everyone has experienced adversity and trauma, I think that disproportionately, and maybe I'm biased, right? Because I was an educator living through it, the pivot that teachers really had to make during the pandemic sent some kind of wave of disruption through the education system. And I think we had an opportunity to really focus on well being. And I think there were lots of conversations around well being during the pandemic, around making sure teachers feel valued, how important teachers are when kids couldn't go to school. And people really realized what it was like to have to not only be with one child all day, upwards of 8 hours, but maybe multiple children in learning pods, things like that. But then once the social distancing stopped and or was limited and things kind of returned back to normal, we missed the opportunity to disrupt the pendulum swinging back to what was normal. And so we returned to what was normal in a time that actually was very transformational for educators. And I think what I'm noticing is the fallout of that. And so what that looks like is increased dysregulation, increased stress response, increased call outs. I think we've been hearing about a teacher shortage for a long time, but I think there's a lot more conversation around a teacher shortage. And then just thinking about teacher quality and the mindset around planning for instruction, working with children, and really having that stamina that it really takes to really be in the thick of what it means to be a teacher, right? The reality of it does take a lot of extra planning outside of times
Mhm.
of the day where you're teaching, right? Which requires a lot of extra effort. When I started as a teacher, that was, I'm not saying it's an acceptable system, but that was very much kind of what you accepted as a teacher, right? And so now I just see a lot more resistance to that. I don't want to say the workload, but it is the workload. And then also just an increase in just teacher mental health challenges. And so
Mhm.
I think we tried to push a system that wasn't working for a long time, but we could pretend was working. We went through a transformational time, which was the pandemic. And then after the pandemic, we tried to keep going. And I think what we're seeing is that we can't keep going this way. And
Mhm.
what that means is we don't have enough teachers to fill roles, and teachers are not only leaving the field, but they're leaving their school buildings faster. And they just are in general less equipped to deal with the day to day of being in education. And I don't
Mhm.
mean
Mhm.
that in a negative way. I just mean
Mhm.
that the system has already been broken, but things just further illuminated the brokenness.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, the pandemic certainly, I think, had a significant effect on everyone. I mean, it had an effect on kids. It had an effect on educators. It had an effect on parents. And I mean, this global trauma that everyone went through, really had an impact. And of course, I think that looking back, it's easy to I guess play Monday morning quarterback, right? But thinking about things that might have been done and the focus, as we return back from the pandemic, certainly there was a lot of focus on, kind of catching up and getting students caught up and the academics. And, while all of that may have been important, it seems like we didn't pause long enough to really get people feeling safe again and get people feeling connected again. And as a result, it seems like, one of the things that we hear a lot and have been hearing a lot really since, kids went back to school was an increase in concerns around, behaviors that were happening and kids that were
Hmm.
having a difficult time. And of course, that adds additional stressors, not only
Yeah.
on the children, but also on the teachers and staff. So, thinking about where we are now, I mean, what are the challenges, and then what do we do about it, right? Because these
Yeah.
things can perpetuate themselves, right? So, I mean, I think about the teacher shortage, and um, if the conversation around being an educator is kind of painted out there in a really negative light, then who's going to want to become an educator, right? So then we
Right.
have a recruitment problem on top of a retention problem. So, kind of, thinking about this, I'd like to kind of begin to think about, like, well, where do we go from now? So we had this
Hmm.
situation, and so let's do that. But before we do, a couple other quick hellos here. Chantel, lead Canadian volunteer from New Brunswick, Canada, and hopefully, Chantel, you're back in Canada now. Lisa said hi to all. We have Trisha here, hi ASR volunteer and cohort 8
Woo!
student in Indy. Yeah, that's great to see. So let's move forward. So
Yeah.
we had the backdrop, and I mean, again, things things were challenging before the pandemic, right?
Hmm.
And there's probably a lot of reasons why. I mean, it'd be easy probably, for me to start going down rabbit holes of probably things that needed to change about education well before the pandemic, and change, both in terms of approaches around what we're doing around kids, but also around educators. So, given where we are, I mean, let's reflect a little bit. Where do you think that we need to go, and how do we begin moving things in a more positive direction? That's a huge
Yeah.
question, but I'll let you kind of take it away.
So I actually think the answer is surprisingly simple, because there isn't a single teacher or educator that I've worked with who is not willing to, first of all, put children first, and then also to be responsive to the shifting needs as a result of the pandemic, as it shows up in children, to be coached, to be receptive to feedback. I think overall, we have to think of adults as malleable. We have to think of adults as coachable, just like we think of children, right? But then I also think it's, again, surprisingly simple in that the trauma informed principles that we ask teachers to provide to students and embody with students needs to be provided and embodied from the top down, from leadership to teachers. I was listening to something that Bruce Perry was sharing on his series about stress, trauma, and the brain insights for educators. And he said something that really just resonated with me, that I knew already to be true, but just reinforced, is that in order to take really good care of students, we have to take really good care of teachers.
Right.
And I think at the end of the day, we are just not taking good care of teachers. And I think that can be reflected in compensation. I think that can be reflected in workload. I think that can also be reflected in some of the hierarchical structures of which when we're working with leadership from the top down with educators, is leadership embodying that relational safety, that opportunity for emotional connection, for building joy among
Mhm.
staff, just like we want teachers to build joy among students. So I think it's really just embodying those principles in all aspects of the educational setting and not just thinking that it applies to children.
Mhm. One of the things I know you do some work with the Trauma Informed Educators Network, and of course, Matthew Portell, who I think we're probably both big fans of. I remember talking to Matthew at one point. It might have been when we were doing a live event, but we were talking about kind of some of the changes that need to happen, and we were talking about kind of even starting very simply at kind of the idea of being trauma informed. And I think one of the things that Matthew shared with me at one point early on in our conversation was this need that the things that we're doing really need to be systemic changes, right? This isn't
Yeah,
just about, okay, well, you learned what trauma informed means, you learned about trauma, and now let's apply that knowledge to working with children. It's about how do we create a culture? How do we create a building? How do we
yes,
create a system wherein everyone is in fact following these practices and is trauma informed, where you are taking a trauma informed approach if you're an administrator with the staff, and if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, you're taking a trauma informed approach with the parents as well as the children.
right.
It's easy sometimes to get kind of focused, and I mean, I guess that's one of the downfalls of anything that begins to get some traction, which is a good thing, right? That the trauma informed ideas to get traction, but sometimes people oversimplify and think, okay, well, it's just a matter of like I did this half day PD and now I'm trauma informed, and I get this, but it
Right.
really is about changing those systems, and systems are resistant to change.
Oh yeah,
Systems,
especially education
yeah,
systems.
yeah. So, and in thinking about some of the things that you shared a moment ago, how do we really show value to educators and better support educators? Because again, if we need an educator that feels seen, heard, valued, just like we want our children to do,
Yes.
we've got to be intentional about that. Yet I think and this is a problem that neither of us can probably solve here, but I think about this, and I think about how long have we been hearing some of these things about teachers. Teacher pay is a good example. About teachers not getting really appropriate and adequate pay. About some of the things that we should be doing to better support our educators, and yet some of these changes haven't happened. So
Mhm.
how do we get there? How do we begin to make some more progress around some of this? Because I think, I mean, it's such an important point that to be able to support anyone well, we've got to be well supported, right? And I think that's such an important thing in education, and it's something we like to talk about, but it doesn't seem like sometimes we're doing a very good job as a society of solving these problems. So tell me your wisdom. How do we change this? How do we get some things, or what can even be done on a system level? Because we know, I mean, you have no doubt seen and worked with people that have been in places where they have been successful in bringing about some of these changes. So, what's that
Mhm.
look like? What's the roadmap for that to really import some of those changes?
The
I,
roadmap. Oh
yeah.
man. Well, I mean, I don't know. I just think it goes down to making time for things that are important.
Hmm.
If we want to make time to build if we want to build relationships among staff, if we want to create joy, if we want to make sure we have a restorative community, then what are we allocating time towards? What does our PD calendar look like? How much time is there for connection? How much opportunity is there for celebration, right? For acknowledgement, for validation? What are the systems in our systems that show that it is prioritized? And I think it also needs to be a conversation with the people in the room that are creating the calendars and, being really just like we expect, you know, the greatest teacher is a reflective practitioner. and is data driven. And I think, if we keep those principles in mind, then we also want to think of leaders, policymakers as being reflective and being data driven.
Mm.
And so, what is the data telling us? What is teacher retention telling us? What are staff culture surveys telling us? And how are we responding? And I think there has to be a willingness to respond. And I
Mhm.
think similarly, if teachers and students are not able to make those changes independently, we coach them and we support them and we provide interventions and we provide plans. And, I think that just makes sense, right? We're all lifelong learners. And so, where are we identifying that there might be gaps in skills to get to a place where we know we need to get to? What data supports that? And then what supports can we provide, leadership, policymakers, teachers, coaches to help move that needle forward?
Mhm,
It's
mhm.
just, I feel like we don't need to reinvent the wheel with creating new things. It's about where are these, we're expecting certain people to implement certain practices, but is it something that everyone's willing to apply to
Mhm,
their
mhm.
own
Mhm,
to
mhm,
their
mhm.
own role, I guess?
Mhm, mhm. So real quickly here, I just saw another comment I just want to share here. Dr. Lori,
Lori!
how you two driving home? What a surprise! Well, I'm glad that we're on your drive home your drive home list of things there, Lori, and I'm sure you're returning from doing something changing the world. So thank you, but good to have Lori here. So let me take that question from a different angle for a second, and again, system change hard, system change needed, system change worthwhile, system
Right.
change really hard. And as an educator within a system, it can be you can easily become overwhelmed by the resistance of the system of change. So I guess my question is, moving away from the system for a second to the individual.
Yeah.
I happen to believe, and I'm sure you do as well, that individuals can make a tremendous difference. I think
Yes.
we both subscribe to the idea of kind of the disruptors for good, right? That sometimes an
Mhm.
individual can help disrupt a system a little bit and lead it into a good direction. So given these challenging times that we've been through, given where we are and given the resistance of systems change, what can individual educators and what can individual educators do to to help change the system in ways that may be more supportive of them or to better
Yeah.
support their colleagues or their students? So where does that work begin?
Yeah, I think it begins in different ways. I think it begins, like, with there's the personal work that it takes just to be well in education, and the fact that it does take consistent effort, and on the personal side, right, time away from work, our well-being is not going to we know the system and the school building may not prioritize our well-being, not maliciously, but it's just how it was built. So we really have to make sure that we're taking that time in our personal lives to prioritize our well-being, whether
Mhm.
or not that, thinking about compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. Are we actively using our insurance, hopefully that our school buildings are providing us, and seeking therapy and really processing our feelings? Are we able to dig into our boundaries? Are we able to relieve ourselves of the conditioning that the system has given us around taking leave, and the, letting go of the guilt, and preserving ourselves and our well-being, and saying, I'm going to schedule my leave proactively so that I can sustain myself through the year. So thinking about the personal work that it takes,
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
just like it would in any job, right? Any high stress job that has high turnover rates and high burnout, it requires some personal effort and personal consistent work. And then I think there's the organizational side. And so I think, depending on your position, being willing to be a disruptor, being willing to ask questions, um, that you may or may not know the answer to, but that maybe no one else is willing to ask. Being able to engage authentically in conversations where there are stakeholders at the table, and you can, if there's opportunities to share your voice, then sharing it, because we can't be passive and expect things to change.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
I also, modeling what we want to see in others. So, modeling being able to create relational safety and trusting relationships with colleagues, modeling being receptive to feedback around our practices, modeling, taking a mental health day and
Mhm,
having it
mhm.
be approved and sharing with a colleague, you should schedule out a mental health day for yourself. Like, maybe it's a co-teacher, I'll take the class for the day. It's okay. Like, take
Mhm.
your day, right? Because I would rather
Yeah.
you take your day than you burn out in a month from now.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and then, you know, starting a team meeting with some deep breathing and making space for gratitude or making space for acknowledgments with each other. Um, finding finding your fellow disruptors and
Right,
connecting
right.
and being, because there's always power in numbers, whether or not you can, you know, make change with 10 people or you can make change with 2 people, that it still is empowering to be able to do that. So I think
Mhm,
there's
mhm,
a lot of strategies that we can take, both
mhm,
on the personal and professional side.
mhm,
And then
mhm.
organizationally, if you can find a leader, which I do feel really grateful in my career, I've been able to find leaders who are able to listen and who are responsive to research
Oh, you're
and
you're you're
who
you're probably a little persistent too, so
a
that's
little
always
bit,
important, right?
yeah.
Right, persistence is
Yeah.
important, yeah.
But, I think Dr. Lori, I did wanna say this when she came on, and I was gonna name this earlier, is, like, such a wonderful example of systemic change as a professor, right?
Mhm,
Because in Dr. Lori's coursework and in her classes, we are reflecting on things like boundary setting. We are making space for focused attention practices in the beginning, for check-ins, because Dr. Lori understands, as someone who embodies this work, as a leader, a trailblazer, and as a teacher herself, that we can't get to the learning if we don't make space for the breathing and for the connection. And so, she's someone who uses her locus of control to start to make that systemic change because she can affect 60 educators in a week, through having this time for connection and prioritizing it. And then they can then take that back to their school building or their team or their single colleague or someone they share an office with
mhm,
and
mhm,
share that word. So
mhm,
I
mhm.
think, just the kind of the fundamentals around
Yeah.
connection, courage, and prioritizing self.
Okay. So in the vein of fundamentals, I want to ask you first, if you would. So of course you're now working with Dr. Lori and at Butler University and adjunct faculty for the program, the Applied Educational Neuroscience program, and of course many of our listeners probably have a good knowledge of Dr. Lori and some of that work, but there are some, of course, that don't. So I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could, like, let's take a step back for a second and give us kind of the overview. What is applied educational neuroscience? So let's start
Yeah.
there. What is it? And then if you want to get ahead of me, the next question is, why is this something that should be interesting to educators?
Yeah, absolutely. So, excuse me. Applied educational neuroscience, well, I'll just speak about this one specifically, is a framework. So it is not an algorithm. It is not a plug and play curriculum. It is a framework that is rooted in 4 pillars. And through addressing with consistency and understanding these 4 pillars with adults and students in education, the idea is that it promotes a really positive, sustainable, and safe learning environment where students and teachers can thrive. So those 4 pillars are the adult nervous system, teaching students and adults about their brain science, so the neuroanatomy, attachment, and touch points. And so through these pillars, you are able to hit on all the really important pieces of what an ideal educational setting would have so that everyone can really thrive.
Mhm, mhm. And so my mind, in getting exposed to a lot of the work that I've had an opportunity to dive into, and that you've taken a dive into, and now that you're helping to teach as well. One of the things that I think is really transformative is that when you begin to really understand your brain and your nervous system, and you begin to look at behavior, whether it's the behavior of children or your own behavior
Mhm.
through that lens of the nervous system, in my mind, it changes really almost everything, right? When you're really looking at things differently. Um, and I mean, so all of this in great, I think to a great degree really begins with the adult and the adult nervous system. So why is it so important that that educators in these trying times focus on their own adult nervous system and their own well-being, and then how does that empower them in terms of their role as an educator?
Yeah. So I did I have to correct myself because I said attachment and touch points, but those are actually one pillar, and the fourth pillar is co-regulation. So I need to kind of go back, but anyway. So when we think about the adult nervous system, there's often a quote from Dr. Lori. I mean, many quotes from Dr. Lori stand out in my brain, but there's one that I find myself reflecting on often that I encourage educators or leaders to reflect on, which um, is my nervous system strong enough to hold myself and hold another? And so we really have to identify our own triggers and our own dysregulation because of the social contagion of the educational setting. I don't know another job. Well, I'm sure there's a few, but for example, I speak to my partner who's a graphic designer who is working behind a computer all day. And, some days he might have some in person meetings, but it's completely different from when you're in education and you work in a school building. From the second you walk in the door till the second you leave, you are having connection from humans constantly, whether it's children or other adults. And so, understanding where our nervous system sits, where stress is activated, if we're feeling more stressed, if we're more triggered, has a direct effect on how we interact with other humans in our job. So it's again like a fundamental component of the job. We have to understand where we're sitting and how that either consciously or unconsciously affects the other humans that we interact with, especially if
Mhm.
we're in charge of teaching and learning.
Mhm, 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 mhm. Yeah, and again, I mean, kind of beginning at a state where you understand your own brain and your own nervous system are able to um, work and work. I mean, in regulation. I mean, it's not a matter of like our goal is not always to be perfectly regulated. We're going to kind of kind of go through various stages throughout any given day, right?
Yeah,
But
which is
but
okay.
that awareness, right? And that's okay. And
Exactly.
that awareness is really important. And of course, when we become aware of our own state, teaching kids and others about, I mean, it's one of the things I always loved about the applied educational neuroscience framework is this idea of actually not only teaching educators about their brain and their body and their nervous system and the anatomy and all of that, but teaching that to kids and seeing how powerful that
Yes.
can be and how empowering it can be when you begin to understand a little bit about your own biology, your own, so I mean, it seems to me that that's something that has a tremendous amount of potential, kind of helping educators in these difficult times. Um, the program, I've been a long time fan of the program. You of course are not only a graduate of the program, but now have come back to help teach of the program. One of the things that I've found in my experience is that um, the people that are going through that program are incredible change makers, often in schools
Yes.
and in other settings. I mean, it's not just even limited to schools. um I frequently recommended to people, that hey, if you're in a district where they can send somebody off to this program,
Oh my gosh.
I'm going to ask you a question. I know the answer in my mind, so there's a
Hmm.
right answer here. Well,
Okay.
what's the
Oh,
word that most graduates of that program use to describe it? What's the word they say about that program? This program was what?
I mean, the word that comes to mind for me at least is transformational.
Okay, I'll take that. But you know what I've heard from a lot of people? Life changing. They're like, that was a
Yeah,
life changing program,
it
and,
is
and it,
truly.
it seems like so many people that have been through that have kind of come out with that, that assessment as well. So certainly, if people, we have a lot of educators in our audience here. If they're interested in you're finishing up a cohort now, correct? So you just have a
Yeah,
cohort that's
cohort
finishing up.
8. Mhm.
So that means a cohort 9 is probably on the way. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I'm not if you are interested in applying for cohort 9, I would, yeah, take a look. I'm not sure if there's a wait list or if the program is full. However, it's definitely worth checking out. I don't have the information on hand, but if you follow Dr. Lori Desatel on Facebook or on Twitter, she is extremely responsive. If you wanted to ask her about the cohort 9 information, I'm sure she'll respond to you. She responded to me before I even was a part of the cohort. So she's just the kindest person, but I know that there's definitely information on her Facebook page about that.
Yeah,
And then
and
just in
perhaps behind the scenes, Courtney might be able to find the link to the
yeah, that'd be
Butler
great.
page on the Applied Educational Neuroscience Framework, and there's usually a link there to find out more, right?
Yes, there definitely
Okay.
is.
Okay.
Yeah. And then just when there we go, revelations in education. You got it. Perfect. Yeah, so I'm not sure what the process is like. I'm still honestly a rookie when it comes to supporting Dr. Lori when it comes to the Butler work with my colleagues, Dr. Dustin Springer and Rob Belt.
Mhm.
But definitely reach out. And like Guy said, it is extremely life changing. And I just wanted to add it's not only life changing, just for self and for work. It's just a very, it just, the awareness that I've been able to build as a human from that work. Even just, we all have adversity. We all, or a lot of us, have suffered from some kind of traumatic experience, right? And some kind of, you know, unhealthy, stressful events in our lives. And I would say that that program was helpful in just processing that too, right? Because we can
Mhm.
understand how our brains work, the wear and tear of our bodies over time. So then we can in turn learn how to support others in the field or children.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a great point. I think, certainly when you begin to understand behavior through a lens of neuroscience, when you begin to understand behavior through a lens that behavior is biology, right? That we're hardwired for
Hmm.
survival, and that so much of our behavior is not, in fact, intentional.
No.
When you begin to understand that, I mean, with children, it's such a huge shift, right? Because so often people look at all behaviors being intentional. And if you think it's intentional, you think it's a matter of motivation. If you think it's a matter of motivation, you come back with a couple of responses, which are rewards and consequences and punishment and all of those things,
Hmm.
which are so often not effective and so often misguided because the issue is not kids weren't motivated. The issue is very often that the kids were having a stress response. And I think
Right.
when you begin to understand behavior through that lens and begin to understand behavior through this idea that not all behavior is intentional, and you look at that against things like brain development, especially when
Hmm.
you look at young children and realize, gosh, the brain develops until we're 30 years old or beyond. This idea that that we these ideas that we hold begin to kind of fall apart, but we also then have the ability to look at our own behavior through that lens
Yes.
and realize that, like, hey, it's okay. We have stress responses. Like, we have
Right.
a bad day. The other day I was having one of those days and I'm like, not
Hmm.
one more thing. I can't take anything else. I had reached kind of that stress response, right? And I think when you're able to see it, you're able to be more gracious and forgiving to yourself as well. And this is hard work, right? Whether you're a child or very much if you're an adult, like, you've got to have a lot of grace with yourself as you're learning these things, understanding these things, and applying these things. But to have and again, there's a lot of different ways that people can learn these things. There's a lot of great work out there. Lori's work, Mona Hook's work, lots of great things out there and lots of opportunities. But I guess the key is really, like, start on that voyage, right? Start on that journey,
Yeah.
and give yourself grace as you're beginning to learn and kind of unlearn things, because we have a lot of responses. So a lot of things we do are the result of the things that were either done to us or that we've been told to do. And change at a system level is very difficult, but change at a personal level can be
Of
difficult as
course.
well.
Yeah.
Tell us, if you would, a little bit about kind of like your journey into some of this. And I mean, whatever you're comfortable sharing, but I mean,
Hmm.
as you began to understand, through this work, how it applied to you, how did that
Right.
ultimately help you, not only to, again, this is about well-being, right? Educator well-being, but to be better, better able to focus on your own well-being, healing, all of those things.
Yeah,
Share with us a little bit about kind of your own experience in terms of
sure.
turning that corner, because I think it's a really important thing for people to be able to, not only grasp these concepts, but these are like deeply applying them to yourself and understanding.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something that's really important about my personal story, and I'm very transparent about this, is that every single thing that I say, again, like I said in my bio, like I really pride myself on walking the walk and
Right.
embodying these practices. So when I'm talking about therapy and I'm talking about recovery and addressing your trauma and working through it and well-being and really taking that seriously, it's because I'm have to do that for myself, because of my own experiences. So, something that is very important to my story is that Washington, D.C. is home for me. And I came home in 2015 after trying early 20s adulthood, in the Midwest, and coming to really hard terms with the fact that I was an addict and I was an alcoholic. And I came home to DC, and I within 2 days of being home, it was at what other people who are in sobriety would refer to as their bottom. It was a very dark emotional bottom for me, and I came home and I was in rehab, outpatient rehab, 2 days later. And within 2 or 3 weeks in rehab, the first time I had had sober clarity in my adult life, I realized how much I just felt called to education, and in particular DC education. And something that's really important to my story is that the first time that I learned about neuroplasticity was in my third hour in my outpatient rehab. Third hour
Mm.
was group therapy, where we would have a topic that someone would talk about or people would share their story. And I remember neuroplasticity really stood out to me then, but what stands out to me now more in hindsight is that I was able to rewire my brain to not depend on alcohol anymore. So I say I'm living proof of neuroplasticity because my neurons
Mhm,
actually
mhm.
rewired to transform my life.
Wow.
So, it just became almost like I don't know if it was like what the analogy would be, almost like a domino effect. Once I realized I belonged in education, then it was off to the races. I was in an alternative certification program for teaching. I was getting my master's and I was in a school. And my first year in a school building, I was finishing my continuing care in rehab, um, for like 70 days of continuing care. So, really immersing myself again in that group therapy and really going through my own healing. And then my second year in education, I noticed children coming in with behaviors that I did not know how to respond to, like self harm, like suicidal ideation, these really big, intense feelings of 8 and 9 year olds that I was asking administrators and people, leadership, what do I do? And no one had an answer for me. And it wasn't because they were mean or malicious, they just didn't know.
Right.
And so I plunged into the trauma research, and somehow I think my sobriety journey, my adversity that I've experienced with acute trauma in my early adulthood,
Mm.
really led me down this trauma informed path where once the research took hold, it was really hard to look away. And I just began implementing. Um, and it became really effective with children while I was also doing all the work that I had to do to stay
Right.
sober, because the stakes for me are much higher. Everyone's stakes are high, but being an addict just changes the game. But
Mhm.
then, even further, thinking about postgraduate courses, right, like Dr. Lori's program, being in recovery in that program was also such an important part of that story, because I was able to dig more deeply into my nervous system as an educator, right? As not a sober person, not a young addict, but like as a sober educator, and what that means and what my triggers might be. And I will say it's helped transform my self-care and my well-being even more. It's all of these different stages of our life. As we build our awareness, we realize
Mhm,
what we're willing and unwilling to tolerate and what we need to fill our buckets.
mhm.
So, these research based practices of connection, of, therapy, of nature, of exercise, hydration, scheduled time off, rest, those are things that I incorporate into my daily rituals every day.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm, mhm.
because if I'm not doing that, then I'm not able to sustain myself in this work, and I belong in this work, and I
Mhm,
plan to
mhm.
be here for a while. But without those practices, I'm not able to sustain myself.
Yeah.
So it really all is just the through line.
Oh, and I appreciate you sharing your story, um, and your journey. And I mean, really, I mean, kind of an ongoing journey. Did you find yourself as you began to dive into kind of the trauma, kind of trauma informed ideas, and took a deep dive in Lori's program in the neuroscience, and um, did you have these realizations like, oh, this all makes sense now, like there were things that began to make sense to you that hadn't made sense to you before, and did that help empower you to not only see others differently but see yourself differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is, at least in my experience with the research, and as you just read more, you just are like, "Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense," right? When you think about attachment and relationships and consistent caregivers and positive coping strategies, right? And like how we respond to stress and adversity when there's the presence of predictability or maybe less predictability, and how, but also something that's so beautiful is the ability to repair and to rewire, right? The
Mhm,
hopefulness,
mhm,
the
mhm,
post
mhm.
traumatic growth that can occur, and how trauma and adversity does not define
Right,
us
right.
as individuals, and that rehabilitation and repair is possible. That provides me with a lot of hope, because if, you know, people were not able to overcome adversity, then I don't think that we would be working as hard in this field as we are. I think we
Mhm,
know that it works and we know that it's possible, and we just want to spread that widely.
mhm,
So,
mhm, mhm. Yeah, it makes me think about, I mean, when you look at the impact of trauma, and of course we know that, a lot of young people, a lot of adults have had, significant trauma in their lives, and we know, of course, that trauma can cause changes to the brain that can rewire the brain in a way that lead to a difficulty, and the more more likely to be hypervigilant, more likely to have stress behavior. To me, learning about neuroplasticity was like, it's the counterbalance of hope against trauma, right? So if you look at trauma, and trauma can cause these adverse changes that occur, neuroplasticity, and Dr. Lori says I think she says it's our human superpower, right? The
yes,
idea
yes.
that through neuroplasticity we can rewire our brains is really hopeful. And I mean, your story, I think, is kind of shares on that line
Hmm.
of, yes, these things can impact us, can lead us down certain situations that are difficult, but that superpower of neuroplasticity and change is really, I think, a tremendous light out there in what sometimes otherwise seems overwhelming. And teachers and educators, I think, and this is an assessment, you can tell me I'm wrong here, but I think a lot of people that go into education because they want to help others, they want to help kids,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
these are people that are very much focused on, like, how do we do good. And what I do know about helpers is sometimes that helpers will put their own needs in the back seat because they're so concerned about the people that they're trying to help or support. But we I think also have to learn through some of this work the importance of prioritizing ourselves, the importance of our
Yes.
well-being. I wanted to talk a little bit about co-regulation in a minute, but
Hmm.
this idea that in order to be a effective co-regulator, we've got to be regulated in order to
Yes.
help us to you be able to balance ourselves. We've got to be able to understand ourselves and prioritize ourselves, and that's hard sometimes for helpers. So, do you have any ideas or tips or suggestions, knowing that educators sometimes are finding themselves in a world where they are prioritizing others above themselves? How do we get that message to people that, like, hey, you're important and you've got to make sure that you're prioritizing yourself if you want to be able to help others?
Yeah.
Any ideas or tips, or
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, again, thinking about how we can affect change in our current setting,
hmm,
right? So it's like, how are we, it's almost like in order to cultivate self-compassion, we also need to show compassion to others. So if we're noticing a teacher or a colleague is, hitting burnout, then making sure that you're that voice to say, "Hey, you have the ability to take a break. It's okay to rest," right? And kind of going against the grind of, it's testing season. We have to keep going. We're not on pace, right? It's like being that disruptor and being like, "No, we're not going to, your kids are not going to be their best self if you are not their best self." Because when we think of co-regulating, you know, I think of a really I think of the situation potentially of a really stressed and burnt out teacher walking into a classroom where they are the the main focus with 25 children, and you may or may not have another adult in that room with you, but the energy that you're bringing in, the contagion is going to spread. So if you are not well and you are just and you are unhappy and you don't want to be there for whatever reason, your students are going to pick up on that, right? And so
Mhm.
we have to make sure that we are well because it is a part of our job. Because if we are not well, then those that we are sharing our emotions with, even just by being in the same space without even speaking, are going to pick up on that. And we're not
Mhm.
going to be able to do the work that we need to do.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
just offering that grace to colleagues or offering, you know, that time and space away or building that trust and that vulnerability with each other where you can have an emotionally safe space to be like, "I'm not okay right now and I
Right.
just need a minute," right? I just need a breath. I just need a place to go, and offering that safe space. But I think it doesn't always need to come from a um peer-to-peer dynamic, right? Or like a
Mhm.
teacher to student dynamic. I think also from the top down, we can offer that co-regulation, right? Educational leaders can be that co-regulating force in a teacher's bad day, right? Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
to make that impact. Because when I think of co-regulation with a teacher and children, I also think of how leadership and their teachers should be co-regulating as
Absolutely.
well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and again, I mean is a necessary that sometimes I think people tend to overlook. These things that need to happen kind of throughout the system, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, Lori did jump in here and say thank you so much. We are still taking
All
applications, so
right.
applications are still being taken for the program,
Wonderful.
which is great. Yeah, in talking about co-regulation. Lori actually did a great little clip recently on co-regulation, and it followed a clip that was out there floating around on the
Mm,
internet with somebody criticizing co-regulation, mischaracterizing
right.
co-regulation, calling it a fad, and really, really saying some things that just simply weren't
Heard
true.
about that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, and I happen not to be a big fan of this person, but I won't go into that any deeper. But often, I mean, we're working sometimes against a counter narrative. We're trying to get some of this information out there about the brain and the body and the nervous system, and better approaches for supporting kids, better approaches for supporting teachers, and yet there is a active group of people that have very different ideas that believe we need more punitive discipline, we need more consequences. We need more suspensions and expulsions, and
mhm,
so I mean, there's certainly are. I mean, I love to see the growth of the work related to bringing trauma informed approaches and related to bringing neuroscience into the classroom. I love. There's a lot of great things happening, but there are also places where these things aren't happening, where people are looking
right,
at the increase in behavior. They're not looking at it through a lens of empathy or trauma or neuroscience. They're looking at it through a lens of control and compliance, and the reaction or the response there often is more punitive things. And quite frankly, we know a lot of these punitive things aren't working.
mhm,
And we also know, if we look through the lens of the nervous system, when someone is having a stress response, quite frankly, I don't think that you need to provide consequences for somebody who's having a stress response. This is a stress response. We need to provide support and help them to understand and navigate. But do you have any thoughts on kind of that other narrative out there, and how do we shift people away? And I know this is a big question, and I'm not
yeah,
not asking you to solve it, but how do we shift people away from that? Because again, there are people that are doubling down on a lot of things that aren't working, and the impact of these things is not it's not successful.
Yeah.
We are not going to suspend and expel our way into better supporting children, better supporting mental health. But there's a lot of people that believe that that's what has to happen. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I have two immediate thoughts. The first one is I would love to see the research that supports the argument around co-regulation being a fad. Are there peer-reviewed articles? Is
Right.
there data to support that? Um, I think engaging in productive dialogue is never a bad thing. I think that's one of the beautiful things about living in the United States is that we can do that. But I think bashing someone with the lens of like propaganda and just to be combative is very unhelpful in a time where we don't need to be unhelpful. We're all people who are in this work, like you said, are doing this to help people and help the world become a better place. So someone that's actively standing in the way of that, I find to be I just mind-boggling. It does
Right.
not make any sense to me.
Right.
So, let's do the research if we're saying
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
co-regulation is a
Yeah.
fad, because there's a lot of research on the other side to support that it's
Right,
not.
right.
A lot.
Yeah, I mean, I always hate to see any kind of us versus them, right?
Right.
The idea is how do we come together and how do we solve problems? Not, but
Yeah.
it's a mindset, and sometimes people stoke fears and uncertainties, and
Right.
it really creates kind of an unhealthy, I think, environment for all.
Yeah. And
And
it's like, do you want to solve the problem or
right.
do you want to create a problem?
Right, 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 right. So, as we're reaching kind of, we've gone over the bottom of the hour here. I do want to invite those that are watching live. If you have questions or comments, you are welcome, as always, to put those in the chat. We'll try to get to a couple questions here. But of course, I'd like to, as we're, heading towards wrapping up here, try to get to a couple of things that, may be helpful to parents and educators. So I'm going to frame a couple questions here for you. One is, of course, part of our focus here today is on educator well-being. We talked a little bit about kind of the conditions out there right now, some of the stresses that are out there. We've talked about the applied educational neuroscience framework. We've talked about, why it's important to prioritize, as a teacher. What can parents do to help support educators? And again, in that us versus them,
Yeah.
we again, well, if you look at the audience of the Alliance and you look at our volunteers, we have a lot of educators, a lot of parents, a lot of people from different
Mhm.
areas, and I think that's important. So, are there things that parents can do to help support their educators, or if we have parents out there watching that are like, hey, that
Yeah.
applied educational neuroscience framework sounds really interesting. Hey, maybe I should suggest that to my school. What might a parent do to help be
Yeah.
supportive and these times?
Well, I think first of all, any parent or caregiver that's asking the question, how can I support teachers, is just already has an amazing mindset. So I just really appreciate even that thinking. Um, I think for me, I think about as an educator and as a teacher, having an aligned view and approach to your children's learning, obviously approaching things as a team, and also just respecting boundaries and asking kind of like the way you would treat a great professional relationship, right? Like, what are some times that I can contact you? What are some things that you're not comfortable with? And kind of being responsive to that, just in kind of any other relationship that would
Hmm.
be have some really clear boundaries and parameters.
Hmm.
um I think also just if parents see injustice happening with children and with teachers, say something. If you
Hmm.
notice that someone has not been treated fairly, or maybe a protocol is questionable, or maybe you notice a staff member has been working really hard and there's been some outcome that is not doesn't seem right, say something, because I think parents' voices really matter. Any parent voice matters. And then I would also encourage parents, since we're on the topic, if parents are experiencing stress, particularly parents of neurodivergent children, um, based on what I've shared here today, obviously I have a lot of experience working with diverse children and diverse adults. But I also want to encourage that my LLC, Live Well Ed, works with parents and caregivers to kind of think about parent advocacy or how to support your neurodivergent learner if you are feeling some stress. So thinking about awareness of our nervous system and those applied educational neuroscience pillars through the idea that parents also need that when we're working with children or learners that have higher needs, right? Or if our stress response is more active or activated. Also offering that through livewelled.com, which you can find, I
Yeah,
believe,
well,
in the
yeah,
chat.
and I have to say, you beat me to the transition because that's exactly the direction I was heading. So I was like, oh, you're going down this. That's exactly what I want to share. Is about the organization that you have started at Live Well Ed, which is great. And again, parents that might be looking for support, definitely go check that out. Um, so to shift as we wrap up here today.
Mhm.
I want to flip back to our educators. So, as an
Yeah.
educator, as somebody that has spent a lot of time in the classroom, as somebody that has been working in and around schools for a number of years now, as somebody that is aligned with kind of the understanding we have around trauma and neuroscience and all of these things.
Mhm.
Um, if you had to give, and we could probably make a top 20 list here, and I'm not going to ask you to do that, but a couple of things, a few things, maybe three things that if I'm an educator, what are three things I could do tomorrow that might be helpful? What are some things that you might recommend to an educator to make sure that they are in fact prioritizing their well-being? What are a couple actionable things that you might suggest somebody do?
Yeah. I would say, try to find joy in your school building and in your classroom. Look for glimmers, things that make you
Mhm.
feel really good and really positive, and try to wire your brain towards that. I
Mhm.
think something that's coming up as I have conversations with teachers is, you know, we're tired. It's a very tiring time of the year, and it's okay to be tired and give yourself grace for being tired, but also try to go out of your way to look for the positives, because when we're tired and when we're stressed, our brain looks more for negative things. So really focus on the positive, not in a toxic way, but just in a helpful way. Number two would be proactively schedule 2 mental health days by the end of the school year.
Mm.
Schedule your leave if you have some left. And then the third one I would say would be, if you are feeling stressed at work, try not to isolate. Find one positive point of connection with a colleague. Um, Obviously, find connection with children, or if you teach middle schoolers or high schoolers, find connection with students, but find the colleague connection with at least one colleague and start to build out your community a little bit, even if it feels awkward. It's really important to have a community in your workspace.
Absolutely. And I'm going to add a fourth one just because,
Yeah,
why not? My fourth one would be go sign up today for the Applied Educational Neuroscience cohort
cohort
nine. Is it
nine.
cohort
Yes.
nine? No, I mean, seriously, it's such an amazing program. And it seems like the educators that have gone through that, kind of come back and become leaders in their schools and their systems and are doing things that promote change. And there's nothing more empowering than feeling like you're involved and actually bringing about a positive change.
And you
And,
can
and
build a community that way. The
Yep,
community is
yep,
really
yep,
strong.
yep. Yeah, that's fantastic. The other thing I would say is, from a parent perspective, again, I think the things that we can do to support educator well-being are really important because when educators are well supported, they're in a far better position to be better supporting our children. And so this really is important that we consider how all these things are connected together, and do what we can. I do have a comment here real quickly. Let's see. Mel said, as a parent, the biggest shift happened for my kid and his educators
Mhm.
came from developing a strengths-based IEP rather than deficit-based. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And I wish we were doing more based on strengths and more moving away from deficit mindsets. I happen to be a big proponent of the social model of
I
disability rather than the
totally
medical
agree.
model. But there's a lot of work to be done there. Angie, this has been really interesting, and it's always great to have you here. It's always great to get your perspective on things. As an educator, as a disruptor, I like to call them troublemakers too. Troublemakers are good, but really appreciate you coming here. Any final words you want to leave us with as we wrap up today?
No, follow Live Well Ed on Instagram and check out our website. We are
Okay.
taking clients, so we would love to work with you, and sign up for cohort 9. And Guy, it's always such a pleasure connecting with you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for all that you're doing to bring about positive change in the world. We need it, and I look forward to and Courtney's behind the stage, here, and Courtney, we need to get Angie booked for a year from now, and we're going to talk about the new role and what you've done.
That's right.
So I mean, I want to book that now because it's like we're booking far out. But look forward to hearing more about things as they progress and more about your business as well. Appreciate you and all the things you do. So thank you for joining us. Those of you that were with us live here today, thank you so much. We'll be back again in 2 weeks, and look forward to seeing you then. So we're out of here, and have a good night.